Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to check, do people need a bathroom break or anything like that? You've been in discussion for a while, or you want to go straight on?
Just had a half hour before you, so I think we're right.
Well,
But we have traditionally had a sort of kind of a little breakout rooms about halfway through to kind of, and I'm sure you're going to be doing something exciting like that.
And I apologize that I've not been as present as I'd planned this week. There were always some days that I knew I couldn't be here. Some fairly tumultuous things have happened, but I'm pleased that I'm still able to be here today. It was looking touch and go a couple of days ago. I'm sat here today on the land of the Kayamai people, which was never ceded. And I feel privileged to have been living here uninvited for 10 years and feel nurtured by the country in which I live. One of the ironies of where I live is if you to look out of this window here, you'd see what we call the quarantine station, which kept the colonizers here nice and safe from their own diseases, but in the process allowed them to enter Australia and unleash diseases and viruses that killed hundreds and thousands of people. And just the name of it reminds us that right across the water still today, we struggle to acknowledge and to really confront the colonial history and the ongoing colonization that happens in Australia. If anybody wants to acknowledge the country they're on, I'm assuming you did it already this morning, but it's always lovely to know where people are joining from. You're very welcome. John, am I able to share my screen?
Yes, just go down the bottom. You should be able to do it.
Okay, before that, there's one thing. In the preparation, there was a little 10-minute video. Could you just give me, you can send it private message if you want, but I just want to get a sense if most people have had a chance to watch that. If not, very soon we'll just pause for 10 minutes and I'll send you the YouTube link and we can watch it. But if everybody's saying they've watched it, then obviously we won't do that. So if you could just send like a yes or no in the chat. Okay, that's no worries. If a few people haven't, what we might do is give a few minutes. If most people have, then we will see. So what we might do is, if anybody hasn't and wants to duck out for a few minutes, I think because most people said they've watched it. If you're one of those that hasn't, the YouTube link is there for you. What I'd like to do is share my screen and show you something I received this week. John, can you give me a nod? Are you seeing something on the screen?
We're seeing your screen, yep.
Yeah.
The kitchen is my favorite place in the house.
Yeah, now, I apologize if I start crying. I'm a bit of an emotional person. This was sent to me by a parent who I work with. I think one of the most amazing things about my job in the last few years, well, for a long time, is the people I get to work with. And this is sent by somebody, a parent with whom I'm writing a chapter and who's been part of a co-design project that we've been working on. And she has 2 children, and this was written by their twins, close in age. This was written by her son, who's 7 years old. And yeah, I'm getting a bit emotional. He has never eaten anything in his mouth. He has never had food in his mouth. He has never had liquid in his mouth. He's always and will always feed through a tube. It started off with a tube that went up his nose. Now he has a tube down by his stomach button. And the way he eats is that he now does it. He unplugs his tube. He plugs in a plastic tube, and there's a syringe full of formula, and he puts it in. He doesn't know what taste means. And yet he says this. That's incredible. And when his mum read this from his school report, she was so emotional herself because it reflects everything she'd been doing to include her child in food and the family and the connection that happens around food. And food is something we take for granted. The idea of eating together is something we take for granted. But one of the things that we learned from the parents that we've been working with is that food fills a stomach, but meals fill hearts. And Valerie, I can't talk about this in a neutral way. And for children who either temporarily or for a long time are unable to eat orally, it's a no small thing to be joining in the heart-filling processes around food, not just the stomach-filling processes. Tubes fill stomachs easy. They solve the medical problem of filling a stomach. That's no problem. If you have a child who can't eat for whatever reason, you can make them gain weight. Like the medical solution is a very simple one. But the social problem of that, to change a tube from being something that's just life-saving to something that's life-enabling, is not a small thing. And that's what the health system doesn't try to do for most parents that we've spoken to. It's not what the health system even thinks it's trying to do. That's what started us on this project, was a pediatrician called me up and said, I have all these parents who are telling me kind of, that's not what I care about. You're talking about my child gaining weight. I'm talking about my child feeling loved. Like there was this big mismatch between what the parents felt they wanted help with and what they were getting help with, which is why we made that website called childfeeding.org, which was about kind of how parents go through life and go from surviving to coping to thriving with their children with feed with tubes. So I'm really, really interested in both the amazing things that parents kind of, I like the word spontaneously, but are already achieving, some of them. But we know for every parent like the one whose son Henry wrote, the kitchen is my favorite place in the house, there are others who are excluded from, whose children are excluded from their early childcare, who don't leave the house for fear of what happens to them when they go out in public, who friends, their own adult friends, turn their backs on them because they feel uncomfortable around tube feeding, who feel judged, feel like failures. And those are the parents I worry about. I don't worry about parents like Jess, whose son wrote that. I mean, she's had a tough time, but Jess knows there are lots of parents. She set up a Facebook group, the MacArthur Tube Feeding Facebook group, and she knows just how many parents there are. Interestingly, it took us a year to find out that a hospital in Sydney could not tell us how many children in their hospital feed with tubes on any one day, or how many children with tubes have ever been through the hospital in a year. It took us a year to find out. They just don't know that information. So children who tube feed, and I will always try and say that, not tube-fed children, because it's a phrase that it matters to parents in the way it's said. Children who tube feed are kind of like orphans in the health system. They fall through all sorts of cracks because tube feeding is needed for so many reasons. Cystic fibrosis, childhood cancer, extreme premature birth, cleft palate, heart surgery, all sorts of things. So it doesn't belong in any one ward or kind of measurement domain of the health system. You also have the issue, and this is what the video is, and if you haven't watched it, I'd suggest kind of just go and have a look, with parents like Karen. And by the way, Karen is very, very aware that this is being shown. That video that you showed, she made public before you saw it. I'm not sharing any private data. There's no issues with it being her real name and her real face that you're seeing. That was something she put out for public use for a health system in health service in Queensland. So I promise there's no breach of confidentiality in anything that you're seeing. For her, it was a different thing. Like it was all about getting the tube out. And the reason why I started, because from the health system point of view, the tube is there to make sure the child gains weight. And as long as that is happening, there is no problem. From a parent's point of view, that's really not the case. Yes, if tubes are permanent, like they are for Jess and her children, you come to kind of live with them as life enabling. And even if they're there for a few years, that's really important. But for most parents of children who tube feed, what it is about a journey towards no longer tube feeding. That's really what parents care about, is getting rid of the tube at some point. But the health system isn't geared up to make that happen. It's geared up to make children gain weight. And the tube is the easiest way to do that. And so we've got lots of stories from parents around how they manage to tube wean. So tube weaning, like you'd wean a child off the breast and onto solid foods, you can wean a child off tube feeding and onto solid tube feeding. And that's the story with Karen and Ella, is because Karen is the only one who's kind of said, yes, completely use this because it's already out in public. Ella is such a special case in Australian medical history that there's no way of being confidential about her. And so Karen is very clear, like, kind of this is Ella's story, and when Ella gets older, she will be in control of that story. So what I was thinking about, most of you have had a chance to see the video. If you haven't, there'll be some time. In a moment, I'll put you into some breakout rooms and invite you to think about Karen and Ella's story. Ella was that child at the end of Ella's video. We saw her eating a cheese stick, a child who doctors in Australia said was not going to do so. And that just a little rehearsal. Karen was she found that she met a mother on the beach, and the mother said, "Oh, yeah, my niece had that, and she went to Austria and got this done." And then Karen went to her people in Queensland and got them in touch with somebody in Melbourne who said, "Yeah, okay, we can get the people in Austria." And they did these video things, and they got 3 other families involved. And 17 days into this rapid tube weaving program, Karen put some food in her mouth. And there were a whole load of other things, but that's kind of the quick version of the story. I'd be really interested for you to discuss kind of that. But before we go into those breakout rooms, I just wanted to give people an opportunity to comment, to respond. I know David's put a comment there. I apologize for hitting you rather brutally with something quite emotional, but this is why I get excited about research, and this is why this is because I think, and this is why I get excited about chat, because I think chat is the kind of research that can really take on these kind of things, and we're not just sort of passive bystanders in the world. So anyway, I'll pause now and really welcome any comments or questions before we go into little breakout rooms.
Nick, can I ask a question?
Go, thanks David, hi.
It's going to be quick. So Vygotsky says that some of it is technological. You figure out ways to teach blind people how to read with their fingers, for example. So, and some of it is the adaptation of society to the defect rather than adaptation of the defect to society. But when you talk about tube weaning, that is very much adapting the defect, adapting the defect to society rather than adapting society to the defect. Is there any way to accommodate, is there any way to organize meals to accommodate tube feeding as well as mouth feeding?
Oh, yes, there is. And I'm just going to put a reference in the chat here, because what you said around that kind of, is it the defect or the society that adapts? Anna Stetsenko and Salau's paper on that is a really nice one. Yes, absolutely. There are ways, when we have, and the website, you'll see things from families are doing that. We had a big tube feeding picnic, for example, where some of the people involved were eating orally and some with tube feeding. The issue is, I'm not sure I agree that wanting to wean a child off a tube is adapting the defect to society. The problem is that actually medically, long-term tube feeding has very serious and lasting consequences. And it actually prevents some key things of development for a child, which can go on to affect their speech and other things that children need to learn to swallow. It can present risks with saliva and all sorts of things. So whilst the tube solves the problem of weight gain, long term, a tube can actually be quite a serious thing. If it's at all avoidable medically, it's very strongly indicated that a tube shouldn't be there if it doesn't have to be there. That's not controversial at all. The problem is there are very few people in the health system who are ready to take the risk of taking a tube out because they're worried that weight goes down. In Australia, if weight goes down, that's a failure to thrive, and children can be removed from parents' homes. So health practitioners have very good reasons to be worried about taking tubes out if weight goes down. Yeah. So you can absolutely tube feed and incorporate it into meals. That's what Jess has been doing with her son Henry. But I do understand why parents wish to tube wean for very good reasons. Yeah.
And Nick, just to mention, my partner spent the last 13 years of her life tube feeding, and we took the same approach of including her in shopping, deciding what to cook, cooking, sitting around the table, smelling your food, watching you eat. So everything bar the actual putting of the food in the mouth, she was included in. And she found that quite satisfactory, to the extent that there was a particular speech pathologist who was determined to restore her swallowing. And she said, no, I don't want to spend the rest of my life struggling to overcome this. I'm going to go with what I've got. Different, of course, if you're in your 60s than if you're a small child. But thanks for the story.
Well, thank you, Andy. And it's always something that I've learned, is you never know when you talk about tube feeding who it's going to connect with in whatever ways. It's something that's far more prevalent than many people think. The things you mentioned there, Andy, around how your partner was included in meals, up to the point of actually putting it in your mouth and swallowing, everything else is open. right? And that's what Jess has been doing with Henry. They've been shopping together, mixing ingredients together, baking cakes together, so that the idea of feeling full is also associated with him with the idea of preparing things and joining in and being with others. He just doesn't have that experience of taste, and kind of the bit from here to here is the only bit that's missing for a young boy like Henry. So I think it's very interesting that we could spend days talking about this issue of kind of disability and defect in Vygotsky. One reason I would be perhaps, at least for now, keen to just park that is for many parents that we've spoken to, they wouldn't use the word disabled or disability in relation to their children because they're not, in many of them. Some of them will just be recovering from surgery, for example, or a cleft palate, and the tube is supposedly a temporary fix that may be several months. So some parents that we've spoken to absolutely reject any kind of discourse of disability around their child. Others, it's absolutely embraced, and it's a very a helpful way of describing their child. They would always say a child with disability and not a disabled child as well, similar to tube feeding. So for me at the moment, my issue isn't kind of the problem of disability per se as the issue of what families with children who tube feed do to take steps towards what they value as thriving. And for some families, that will be eternal tube feeding. For other families, that will be coping with thriving whilst tube feeding happens until it stops. And for others, it's thriving is about moving away from the tube. And it's not my judgment to make as to what their horizons for those futures are. And they're very different for all the families. So those of you who've seen Karen and Ella's video, I'll set up the breakout rooms now. And I'm particularly interested in what you think the conflicts that somebody like Karen experienced. And what particularly, building on Annalisa's session yesterday, I'm sure she'll have mentioned kedge anchors and warping. John, is that true?
Yes.
Yeah. So what I find interesting about that concept is, as a part of stories of radical transformation, in Annalisa's case around the Finnish Homes First strategy, and in a story like Karen and Ella's, where the transformation of never having had food in your mouth to eating all your food orally, like that's a big change for Ella, a big change. And yet I think part of how we understand how that change happens is for looking for these, what Annalisa would call the kedge anchors, the warping, how we find stability, how we find something to pull on. But also that for Karen, this was not a conflict-free kind of process. You also might consider, and this is kind of me being selfish and asking for help here, but if you had to represent her story in some way as one of future making, of transcending the status quo, which I think Karen did, considering this had never been done had never been done in Queensland before, and had only been once been done with an Australian family who had to pay for themselves to go to Austria. So she really was quite groundbreaking, breaking away. What would be important to you in capturing the elements of her story in a way that you think kind of foregrounds what chat researchers care about? I wouldn't impose what that is on you. Everybody has their own kind of corners of chat that they feel comfortable with and take value from and nourishment from. So yes, maybe in the rooms, I'd just consider any particular conflicts you pick up in her story, and you've got the transcript for her as well from her interview. Any anchors that you see that she puts down and pulls on to move her family forward, kind of warping. And if it was you and you were wanting to kind of capture or represent her story in some way that reflects what a chat person might be interested in, what would it be important for you to capture? Does that make sense as some questions to consider? So John, there are, if I do assign automatically into 3 breakout rooms, would that be roughly on the par with what we've done?
Well, we've been usually smaller groups. 3, see, you've got 26 people here. 3 would give you about 9 per group, 8 or 9. It depends how many. So think of the size of the group that you think is appropriate.
Okay, it's just slightly more people than I've figured on my screen. So I'll make it maybe 6 breakout rooms. That's 4 people per room. Is that more close to what you've had over the week?
You'll have 4 or 5 per room. Yeah, as you actually allocate the breakout rooms and your little breakout room thing, it'll actually tell you down the bottom how many per group. It's kind of quite nice, actually.
It'll be 3 to 4 per room. So I'd say at least like 10 minutes for this. And, you know, kind of if you stay a bit close to those questions, and I'll type them in the little broadcast prompt, that's wonderful. But if you diverge and you end up talking about something related to chat in connection with Karen and Ella or tube feeding, wonderful. Like, you know, as long as there's that kind of intersection there, I think it would be a rewarding thing to do. So here we go. See you in 10 minutes, just about 11:05.
Yeah, so you'll call us back.
Yes.
Yeah, good.
Sounds like you've been having an amazing week. I'm gutted that I wasn't able to join.
Fantastic. Just saying, fantastic. Yeah, I don't know about everyone else, but since yes, yes.
Welcome back, everyone. Just firstly, a little clarification. The transcript I mentioned wasn't provided to anyone. It's there now for people if you are interested and, you know, kind of wish to see, warts and all, how Karen made this happen. You're invited to do so afterwards. That's fine. It is a transcript. She is comfortable to be shared with people. It won't be necessary for what we have left, so don't worry that it isn't there. You haven't read it. It's not your fault it wasn't there. So I'm really interested. We had one really interesting comment from Jill in my group particularly, which I'll mention, but if you'd like to type in the chat or unmute what came up in your groups, that would be really nice. David, you've unmuted.
Oh. Go ahead, Nick. I just made a mistake.
So perhaps from one of the other groups, would somebody just share a bit what you talked about?
Hi, Nick.
Hi, Melissa.
We had a good discussion. We were looking at the transcript and different key points, and we talked about when Karen realized that there was a conflict of motives. So all these, firstly, they thought they were aligned with the medical team, that they wanted the same thing. But then gradually, as all the health issues and the vomiting and all that started to happen, then you can see them gradually realizing, okay, well, what we want here is not aligned. And then she realizes there's a conflict of motives, and that's a key point of departure when she starts taking action to do that. And then what she finds, we talked a little bit about this, her moving to the Mater hospital, where she found her people, so she found people who had motives that aligned with hers, and then they were able to collaboratively work to help Ella get better. And so that was one of the things we talked about. And then also her transformation to become an activist in the end. But yeah, we're really interested in this how she ended up in this kind of collaborative work, I guess, with the hospital.
And I think, Melissa, you put your finger on the thing that I'm going to spend the next few months trying to really understand, is that it wasn't the fact that Karen sort of, moved from one practitioner who was a bit reluctant and found another one who's like, yay, let's go. She did a huge amount of work to enroll and persuade vast numbers of people in vast different parts of the health system towards this vision. And Anne Edwards would, say this is relational agency in a kind of a very palpable form. That, instead of just saying to her pediatrician, oh, I'd like to give this a go, she's like, I want you to call this psychiatrist in Melbourne whilst I'm in the room, because that psychiatrist is a big, person. And so she's mobilizing other people's expertise. And when then she's like, yeah, but the critical care nurse isn't going to like that. But she really listens to the pediatrician, so she gets the pediatrician to lead that team. And there's a whole load of things. Now, I've tried to kind of, though my best guess go yet at kind of not representing, but thinking about this. So you're seeing a rather messy diagram, like of a circle with some things. So these are all the different people that were involved, at least that I know of. There will be others. And there's kind of, those lines in between are connections that Karen makes between people. And so kind of she connects, a person on the beach to somebody else, one parent with another one, this hospital to another one. The dots are kind of the different groups in which they originally belonged. And so what you see, if you look here at about 10 or 11 o'clock, you've got the pediatrician who originally just belonged to the local hospital, but then became part of a critical care team, but then also became part of this Austrian healthcare program. Or you get the hospital lawyer who gets involved with somebody else, and yet she brokers through the hospital lawyer by talking to a friend who happens to know how legal things work and how she can, she had to argue against the hospital lawyer who said, no, we won't do this because it was too risky. So lots of conflicts, I think, Melissa, and the way a large part of the way she resolved those was pooling, but activating and enrolling other people's expertise into this kind of trying to get these very fluid coalitions of people around to have a shared vision that what they could do for Ella and that it wasn't too dangerous. Lots of people were still really worried about it as they unfolded, but I think that's a really key part. Thanks, Melissa. What other comments or questions do you have?
I was in group 6 and the group informed me that I was the person to feedback. We essentially had wonderful discussion, which was Paul and David and myself. It boiled down to 3 things. A very strong anchor from the family that Ella had a right to quality of life, not just life, and them wanting to make that happen through the social sphere. The connection to cultural historic theory was that from the social comes other learning through interaction with others, and then we also spent a bit of time continuing to talk about the word defect. But I think quality of life was the strongest. The family's conviction on her right to have quality of life and wanting to make that happen.
And it's interesting, in that video, Karen says feeding is a human right. And I'd never heard that said before, you know, kind of like it's just, so I think, yes, and that's what I think what we saw happen when we've talked with parents who've gone from coming home from hospital with a child who's tube feeding and just being totally consumed with how you manage syringes and what happens when it comes out and how you tape it onto here. Over time, you come to like, okay, we've got this. Now let's think about the quality of life. Let's think about the developmental opportunities for our child. Like, can you go swimming? What happens when we try and get them to go to a play group and all the children run away, and that kind of thing. And for Karen, you know, that's very, very palpable. Jenny, I've noticed your comment about emotions. I will absolutely put my hand up and say, so far, I've been an ostrich on that front. I put my head in the sand. If I was to tackle that, I would say Nikolai would be a very good person to talk to as somebody who's done so much work on Perez-Javanier and other things like that. It's not a corner of chat I read much on or know much about. Of course, this is a hugely emotionally freighted thing for everybody involved. Oh, sorry, David, yes, she says eating is a human right. What she was, yes, sorry, yes.
Nick, I think that lovely networking diagram that you just showed us is a good representation of the kind of knowledge that's developed by self-help groups and activists, issue activists, as distinct from disciplinary knowledge. That self-help groups and activists build up knowledge by accessing all the different specialisms which are stuck in silos and pull it all together. It's a different kind of knowledge, and that intrigues me.
Could you say a bit more about that? Where else have you seen that?
Look, I took the trouble for example, to read a book about self-help groups, which included, for example, a group on stutterers. And the stuttering group became experts in their topic, and they knew the latest research. When papers were published, someone would spot it, and now they would call the specialist in to talk to them. And all the different, like you showed, different aspects of the issue fall into different parts of the academy. And the academy, one building doesn't talk to another, but the people, in a self-help group pulled them all together. The AIDS activists is another case where the AIDS activists were storming medical conferences and demanding to be included, and actually revolutionized the practice of clinical trials in the process because they brought together the experience of the patient with virology, which were sort of weren't together. There's a couple of examples, yeah.
You also see it in the socio-scientific literature as well, where particularly environmental issues and local activists get really quite expert, not only in some of the scientific knowledge, but also the local knowledge, the kind of mixing of local and scientific. And I was really interested in the way that the different epistemologies within that network of the law, the caring, the scientific scientific ideas all sort of interacted. It'd be really interesting to see.
Yeah, that's an interesting point I haven't thought about. What would that look like if you kind of did a similar diagram for the kinds of knowledge and epistemologies going on? And I think what both Andy and John have just said, and Judy's comments as well. Jill, would you kind of echo the comment you made in our group? Because I think that sort of coalesces quite a bit of the discussion so far.
The individual to collective action. So the fact that she started out with an individual interest, and I was, as they're talking, I'm thinking you start pinpointing, you connect the dots, and as soon as you start connecting the dots, you move from this idea of I'm alone, I'm doing this with my individual agency, to this collective that is moving forward and reaching new possibilities, right? So I don't know if that's what I said, but that's what I'm thinking.
with when I was first met, and so I've had a lot of time now with Karen, I could not, given how generous she's been with me and what she said, look her in the face and say, there's no you in this story. There is no individual kind of part of that. I just couldn't do that. It would be utterly disingenuous and offensive to do so, I think. But you can't say she did it alone. And this is why I think chat is so wonderful, is that, through many, for me, it's Anna Stetsenko, Annalisa Sonino, and Anne Edwards particularly, we get to have both. We don't, we can recognize the social and the collaborative and the, kind of all the different coalitions that are part of this, and not only the ones in terms of the people who actually interact, but the fact that many of the means through which this came to happen for Ella were culturally inherited and socially available. And there are all sorts of things to do with Karen's class, for example, which made these things available to her in a way that they wouldn't be available to other parents. So society is definitely there in many, many ways. But in chat, we can take that without throwing Karen making this happen out of the window, because Karen did make this happen. Like this, she really did. And as Judy said, but that was also contingent on a very chance encounter on the beach. She absolutely says if it hadn't been for that, she may still, Ella may still be tube feeding. And that's what I think is fascinating, and where chat gives us lots of different ways of grappling with that. I think that's people. So there's something about language that's coming up in the use of words, which is not why I come to this, but I think it's important because it's being discussed there. So David, you're commenting quite frequently on that. Would you share something with us?
Words are powerful, but they're not omnipotent. I can't believe I'm saying that. And one of the problems with reading Vygotsky is he uses words like idiot, moron, cretin, and he does use the word defect. Now, the real question is, what does he mean by those words? And when you read it, you realize he's trying to give them scientific content. It's been suggested that we can get over a lot of problems by using more vague words, like special needs, or additional needs, or additional languages instead of second language, or something like that. And this is antithetical to the kind of technical vocabulary you need if you're going to do research. So what I'm going to suggest is that words are very powerful and we have to be used very carefully, but that in fact, words become derogatory, not because of the words, but because of the societal relations that underlie words, and that we can't fall into fetishism. In a sense, the whole of Vygotsky and the whole of Marx is about seeing the underlying societal relations behind commodities in the case of Marx, and psychological phenomenon in the case of Vygotsky, and now linguistic phenomenon. And that the problem is not this word or that word, it's the societal relations that underlie them.
I think that's very helpful. I'd certainly recognize, for example, one of the colleague who sits in the office next to me when we are in the office, she's published for years in journals that are called something like special educational needs, and yet that's now a very uncomfortable phrase for many people. So it's difficult to navigate. What I suggest now, because you have been going for longer than me, is perhaps a 10-minute pause. And for those of you who haven't yet, I invite you to go and have a look at this website, childfeeding.org, and particularly at a couple of sections of it, which I can provide direct links to. There's one on real stories, and there's one kind of, if you go and you click on the families word at the top, you will see things like what can I expect, tips and tricks. That's quite a nice thing to look at. And the word tool will come up, I think, probably, at least for me. Tools still can be sharp, and both kind of in their worldly effects and in their conceptual precision. But maybe, like, you can just mute and switch your camera off, go to the loo. Let's take 15 minutes. So it'll be 11:25 by the time I talk. So let's reconvene at 11:40. After which time, hopefully you're feeling stretched, your eyes have had a break, but also a bit of time to have a play in that website. And the questions I'm interested for you to sort of pick up on, this is now adopting the language perhaps more of Anne Edwards, is based on what you're reading there in the real stories and the tips and tricks and other things, what matters to the family? So everything on that website was co-produced with families of children who tube feed. There's a part of it that's, let me see if it's actually, it was launched yet. Yeah, there's some of it's in Nepali language. If you click on Kuzi Meals, because we did a project that was with the Nepalese community here in Sydney, but it's all in English as well. It's all kind of double done, that part. What matters to these families? And how is what matters being turned into common knowledge? Common knowledge is not as in everyday knowledge, but something that allows people to kind of, well, I guess Anne calls common knowledge a resource or a tool that's used by others to work on complex problems. So it's like a secondary stimulus, if you want to use that language. So our intention in the website is to echo what Anne Edwards and Faye did. They developed an app which holds common knowledge for young people with autism as they navigate transitions from school to the workplace. So it's a way of capturing what matters to these young people with autism and communicating that with their employers. Things like kind of predictability in what's coming and knowing in advance about things that might happen and things like that. So Anne had this idea of an app that was a repository of common knowledge in quite a personalized way for individuals with autism. We're conceiving of this website as something more kind of general than that, but perhaps something that holds common knowledge, i.e. a reflection of what matters, that then other people might use as, I might say, a tool, though I know that's not the best way. It might be a sign or a means to do things. But also in the details of everyday life, and this is where I really love things, if you have a look through the tips and tricks and other things, there's something about objects from everyday life getting repurposed and becoming means of solutions. They're part of how families go from surviving to coping to thriving. A huge part of that story is in the reuse or the repurposing of everyday objects, like Velcro things that normally hold TV remote controllers and makeup bags, all sorts of things like that, glasses, straws, like all sorts of things. If you want to do some digging around to find some of those everyday objects that are happening there, because I think that's a really nice way of kind of looking at agency in these families. So a break back at 11:40. I'm not going to go anywhere. If you want to just stay and ask a question, that's fine. Otherwise, I'll see you in 15 minutes and hope you have a bit of a chance to have a bit of a play on the website.
Nick, can I ask you something?
Of course you can, Isabella.
I was curious, how did you get involved with this subject?
Completely by accident. So for 10 years, I've been doing research in services in Australia that support families with children under 5. They're all kind of tertiary services, which means that there's kind of some vulnerability or risk that's been identified by the health service, or parents have sought help at kind of universal healthcare levels, like with a GP or a community nurse, and it's kind of escalated. And through that, my name was given to a pediatrician who runs one of only 10 multidisciplinary pediatric feeding clinics in Australia. So these are feeding clinics where you have a pediatrician, a speech therapist, an occupational therapist, and a dietitian, and often an interpreter. And there's not many of them, and the waiting list to get into them is about a year, 6 months or a year. And this pediatrician phoned me up because I've been doing all this research with parenting services, and he said, I realise we're missing something, that we need a non-health set of eyes on this. He's an extremely humble guy for a pediatrician. He said, like, kind of, he's picking up that he says, I don't think we're actually addressing the problem these families have. And so we got somebody from a business school who looked at organizational practices, and me. So there's a team of 2 academics, a pediatrician, a speech pathologist, an artist who's taken a whole load of pictures for you. I'll put that in the link, just the most amazing photographs. And 4 parents, kind of regular participants on the team. So by accident is the short answer.
That's very interesting.
Nick, in the early 1980s, I was participating in ACT UP in New York City. And then I had this interesting experience of moving to Paris and I was there when ACT UP in Paris was founded. And one of the weird things we had to do was figure out French words for all of these different onomastic practices that ACT UP had worked out in New York City at Cooper Union, where the ACT UP meetings were all held. And about halfway through this, I realized that the key problem is not figuring out words that won't offend anybody, because no matter what word you come up with, somebody is going to figure out some way to offend, to take offense. It's actually just figuring out particular signs. And actually, you know, there's the opposite as well. I mean, one of the things that happened in ACT UP is that people would just take a word and say, okay, faggot. We cannot do without this word. We got to have it. And so the only thing to do is to take it and do what Black people have done with nigger, which is to not make it unmentionable, but to make it so mentionable that it loses its negative connotations. And we did some of that. And we did but about halfway through this, I realized that it's not this word or that word. It's figuring out signs that will keep the collective, which in our case was ACT UP Paris, keep the collective together. And it, you know, I'm tempted to say that it doesn't, you know, and probably Andy would say something like this. Andy would say something like, actually, it's the action that keeps you together and not the language that you use. The language divides you, but the object of activity is what unites the organization. I don't see that at all. I mean, I think the language was as important a part in keeping the collective together as the object of activity was, because people had very different objects of activity, but what kept people coming week after week after week was the language that was forged.
I think if you were to change that, this is me thinking on the spot, if I was to swap the word language for sign, I think that's certainly capturing something about the parents. And that's why these photographs taken by this artist were so important. That when we did this co-design with parents, what they said is, I want, well, they use the word imagery. But I want imagery of children who tube feed that debunks people's assumptions about them being fragile and sick and trapped in the house and everything like that. And so we made some 30-second videos I'm going to show a few later. But there's this one picture on that website, I just put the link in just now. If you click it through, there's a young boy pulling his shirt up and you can see the tube in his stomach.
Yeah, I saw it. No, I saw it last night, yeah.
And it's just beautiful because he's doing what every kid does, you know, everybody does that.
Yeah.
And if that in your, if I get you right, if that's acting as a sign that says this is what we all stand for, right, is this idea of the children that we care for being full of life, and that actually what we care about is their childness and, you know, kind of their being full of joy and all those things in childhood. That was a sign for them. It was interesting, of all the photos, nobody has ever picked any other than that one as their favorite. Mm-hmm. But I think if that could be a sign on your language, then yes, the word is not what they never were. The word to use was never what they were worried about. It was the sign they were wanting to create. Yeah. Sound interesting what you were doing in Paris.
I was living in China, but I would go to Paris for months on end because I had a girlfriend there. But yeah, it was a moment of history.
Nick, just to sort of make excuses for myself, I've mucked things up in that I tried to get back to your links, both of your video and the other link. And of course, I couldn't look at it because your voice was coming over the top of everything. So I actually logged out. And of course, that meant I couldn't get back into the chat because the chat just evaporates off your screen. So I'm once again in the ignorant stage. Please excuse.
No worries. Here they come again.
Thank you. But I'll still have the problem. I can't link on either of them because while you're talking, I can't hear. It's a problem in my use of this system. But thank you for repeating those.
That's all right. If you wanted, you could copy and paste them and look at them at a later time or something.
That's what I'm going to do. That's what
the others. Only the video would require the audio. The others are pretty much visual only. I mean, there's some videos.
Okay, right. Well, it was the video that I was trying to get to. But no, I'm intrigued because I believe chat has utilities way beyond what many people see, who focus upon its origins and the purity and all that sort of thing. But I believe it's an enormously useful tool. But you have to depart a bit from maybe academia to actually get the best use out of it. Best understanding through academia, best use possibly not through academia.
Well, and I think you would find certainly a kindred spirit with Anna Stetsenko, who talks about a banal biscuit box version of Vygotsky that's come to dominate and saying we need to make it dangerous again, by which she means part of an activist struggle.
Yeah.
I have deep sympathies with her position on that.
Right. Yeah.
And
I would love to tell the story about the Australian dictionary that describes the word bastard, but it would be impolite for me to do it in this company. But it does make the point that context is everything, and that when you look at what Vygotsky is said to have said, and it's through a translation, you're not confident purely, significantly, that that's what Vygotsky did say, because he's speaking in Russian. And so, yeah.
And in a particular time in history as well.
That's right. Context is everything, and hard to get into it, yeah.
Thanks, Lewis.
I want to say something about photographs, but I urge everybody to go look at Nick's photographs. There's a danger, and the danger is that we imagine that the object of the photograph is expressing the same thing as the photographer. And in fact, whenever you look at a photograph, you're looking at a composite sign in more senses than just the photographer has talked to the person and told them to produce a particular effect. It's, in some ways, when you're doing photography, it's far more of a composite sign than when you're painting a portrait. Because I remember being a portrait painter in China, we just painted the model as if it were an object of meat. And photographers can't do that for the same reason linguists can't. Linguists have to constantly be sensitive to the fact that language alters not just what it's describing, but more immediately, the person it's describing to. A language has that altering effect. And for that reason, using language as data, as Vygotsky says, it's exciting because you're watching people actually produce evidence at the moment of the crime. But it's also incredibly tricky because there's this built-in reflexivity in it, which you find with photographs as well. Anyway, that's what I was going to say about the photographs.
And that's why I kind of, well, in this paper we're going to write, it's going to be the artist who took those pictures is going to be one of the co-authors, so that we get that, you know, kind of, that person taking the photographs is there. So it's going to be me, the pediatrician, Jess, and the artist will be writing together, which is going to be fun. Yeah, a couple of minutes left. If you're one of those people who prefers to leave your video off, just when you've arrived, if you could do a thumb up signal with the button, or just give me a yes in the chat, that just so I know when people are back here. Otherwise, switch your video back on when you're back with us.
Yes, I mean, there is the tradition in this summer school of having a video on. There are a few where the bandwidth is so poor that they can't, but that's only the tiny minority. You'll see them down at the end. But yes, we tend to have it on.
Good to know. I think I might get away without crying for the rest of the morning, hopefully. It ambushes me every time.
Yeah, it's very moving.
I have a terrible time describing test development because when I first came to Korea, I was asked to do test development for the college entrance exam. And that year there was a spate of suicides. And every suicide I kept looking, where was the test question where the student put their pencil down and went home? You know, was it my test question? Was I the person who wrote those words? So, you know, what Valerie says when she says words are powerful, it's true. I think that words are not all powerful and we do fetishize them, but interpersonally, words, and this is part of the problem, that words are powerful interpersonally, but there are parts of our sociocultural system that they simply don't touch. And photographs don't either.
Yeah, and there's what you mentioned reminds me, I went through a circle of security parenting program in the past project. I was an observer of it, and they have this concept of shark music, which is the idea that you might be on a nice beach, you know, with your kids, and you know, to everybody else, it's, you know, like white sand, calm sea, blue skies. And for you, it's the Jaws music because your kid hates the sand or has started throwing up, and it's just like, you know, or whatever it is. And you never know what other people's shark music is. Yeah, but we all have it, you know, it might be the idea of, you know, kind of testing or something like that. But I think it's such a beautiful idea. Parents, I've seen so many parents take it up and go, this is my shark music. And as soon as they got the word for it, they can name it and they can kind of be in a relationship with it and turn the volume down on it, or at least say it's there. Anyway, a slight digression. Well, just if you're, it's close to 11:40, so I'm hoping people will come back fairly soon. Yeah, Judy's back. Camilla, welcome back. Jessica, Sharon, good to have you here. In the interest of time, I just want to share one thing with you. You might have seen it in the website. We're going to share a couple of things. This one first. Are you seeing a little boy?
Yes.
So this captures something that's many parents have told us is important. So what we did as part of the project was we commissioned an artist to come in. She spent several days with families of children who tube feed first, and then I think she's deaf herself actually. And then she spent a few weeks with them with a camera. And this is her favorite picture. And these pictures were exhibited in a hospital in Sydney, a whole series of them. And every parent we've spoken to said this is also their favorite picture. Because it's little Ethan here. Everything is what a child, you know, what you might expect a child to do, but you suddenly notice something small out of place. You know, it's called a PEG, percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy, the little tube there, that goes straight into his stomach, and you stick a straw in that, and a syringe or a pump can do it, and that's how he gets to feel full. And one of the other parents, not Ethan's parent, but another one I spoke to, said why she liked this picture was it reminded her of a time when she took her daughter and her two daughters, in fact, round to another person's house to play, and the younger daughter was tube feeding, still had a nasal one, so it sticks there and then it kind of comes around and just sits at the back of their head. And a parent, like I think a ball had come past a group of parents at this garden party or whatever it was, and the older daughter ran over, and one of the parents said, oh, you know, kind of, I've noticed that your sister has a tube. Can you tell me about that? And the girl said, oh, it's just how she feeds. Now, will you give me the ball? Because that's what I asked for. And it was the child saying, this is not what matters to me, is how my sister feeds. What matters to me is playing ball, and you're not done what I asked. And she was this amazing, her parents said, she's the most amazing ambassador for her sister. She was just like, this not a part of their relationship, was this tube. That's how it came to be in their life. And for the kids, it was being a child which was important. And that's what, for that mum, that was kind of, that was it. It was just about, we want these children to be children. This was a picture that many parents shared with us before we started taking pictures. So in Australia, there is an almost militant campaign that says breast is best. That if you're a mother and you have a baby, you should breastfeed it. It's the best thing for you. And if you do not do that, you are doing second best. The midwives are extremely militant on that, as I've experienced. They accept that not all parents can do that and that bottle feeding is okay, but it's not best. And there is this counter movement, which is fed is best and fed is fed. And one parent we worked on, I can send you a YouTube link, we're on Channel 7 News, the paediatrician, and in fact, Ethan's mum was on Channel 7 saying fed is fed and fed is best. And this picture was shared with us independently by many parents, because you have breast, bottle and tube there, and yet all the parents are in that same warm, loving relationship, embodied relationship, skin to skin. They're all sharing the moment of feeding with their child. And a lot of them feed versus bottle, and they're like, and where does tube come in? And so that put us onto the kind of the line of perhaps imagery being quite important, which is one reason why you see so many pictures in the website. But now I'm interested, I'll set up those same breakout rooms again. I'd be really interested for you to think about, kind of with your, David, I nearly used chat goggles and the lens metaphor, but I'm not going to. No, because I'm with you, I don't like the idea of lens.
You started a monster here.
Well, no, I've been saying it for years that I as an editor of a journal, we reject so many articles because people have said, I'm going to use Foucault. And like Foucault is the red goggles, and they look through the red liquid and they go, whoa, holy shit, everything's red. And you're like, yeah, that's not using theory. So I'm really interested in what you think of the website from a thinking through chat. Kind of what matters to these families. That's the question that Edwards draws us to, right? It's her articulation of motive, because she's careful with the word motive because so many people take it wrongly. Not within chat, but outside. If you talk about motive, people think, how motivated are you? So she uses the phrase, what matters? And particularly, what everyday objects do you think are being there? And kind of, I think everyday objects are being transformed into tools of agency, but expression you might disagree with. But I'll set up the breakout rooms again and invite you to think about that and any other things you see there in the website. There's the real stories, the tips and tricks, other things that you think connect with chat in a way that kind of matters to you. We'll make them the same rooms again if you're happy with that. And again, another at least 10 minutes. So it'll be 11:55 or 56 or something like that. I'll send the closing signal. If you want me to come into a room with you, if you've got a question, I think John, they can do the call out, right? And yeah,
I don't know, actually. I suspect so, yes. If you know, you can do it.
So see you at just closer to 5 to 12. Welcome back, everybody. Yes, Susang was just saying you must have been having amazing discussions that you want to eke every second out. So once again, I'd love to hear something from the other groups that I wasn't in. What was coming up for you in terms of what matters to parents, the use of everyday objects, or anything else that you felt resonated or something that you wanted to explore through chat? Valerie, were you nominated again by your group?
I think I kind of was by default. Three particular objects. There were more, but three particular ones I can give a reorientation to. The makeup bag makeup is often associated with beauty. The headband, where a parent tucked in the tube behind, wearing a headband is often associated with being cool, and a cup holder for me anyway, a cup holder means driving through McDonald's, and McDonald's means Happy Meals for the older generation, but it's a happy place, McDonald's. And so these items were used practically and purposefully, but they were shifting an image of the child from a medicalized version to being beautiful, cool, and happy. And I really like that. And then our conversation went a little bit to social cultural, historical perspectives and community, the social, and so forth. And I think that's a short summary. But we also discussed mathematics in Sri Lanka.
Tell us about that.
Shyama can do that. Then I'm out of my feeding bag.
I can talk when we have time.
Absolutely. We can do it now, Shyama. Well, maybe we'll come back to Shyama. So Valerie, what I thought was really interesting what you said was that the initial, the purpose of the makeup bag was to hold a tube, to stop getting in the way. The headband, the same thing. The cup holder, something slightly different. That was to enable tube feeding whilst moving around. But that's not the end of their use. That's not the end of the story in the repurposing of these objects. They become part of something else, something perhaps more diffuse, but really, really important, which is in a kind of how these children get to be part of everyday life. You can go to a playgroup if you can put the tube in a makeup bag. It's not just about holding the tube, it's about what holding the tube then means. And then, you've got a headband. So yeah, it's really interesting. I was fascinated. The list of things we've got that have been repurposed and reused in this way is really, really long. I love diving into that. Thanks for picking up on those. Shyama, will you tell us a bit about mathematics in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I'm doing an app for geometry. Can you hear me?
It's a little broken, but yeah, it's good.
Yeah. It's like my study. I'm in final year PhD student here in Waikato. So I'm using this for especially the to analyze my data, because geometry is some cultural heritage coming from our country. Like we are very popular in our culture. The people can work many geometry structures. But now it's becoming a big issue for the country because students are no longer doing the geometry, and like a labor force is going down, and so many issues coming due to the weakness of geometry. So I'm doing some work for that. That was my main significant issue for that. But here what I have learned is like analyzing view, how to see the objects relevant to the context. So it's what like a very roughly.
Well, thank you, Shyama. There's something I'm not quite sure I'm still in as excited by this term as I was when I first read it. And I know, because I chatted with the author, that I kind of slightly misconstrued it. Theodore Shatsky, a practice theorist from Kentucky, uses this expression, practical intelligibility, which I take to mean that kind of objects come to have meaning or be useful, not inherently in themselves, although not separate from that, but from their enrollment into practices. So a chair is a thing to sit on as long as you sit on it, but it can also be a step if you need to reach the light bulb at the top of the ceiling. And that it's through the activity or the action that you need a human being involved to turn a chair into a chair or into a step or whatever else it is. And there's something about, I think there's something about practical intelligibility in the use of these everyday objects, although it's not the concept I now kind of run with. But yeah, I quite like that. Rather than context, for me, I don't know, I struggle with the idea of context, probably because I'm just not very good at writing about it that doesn't let it end up being some kind of container. But what I liked about practical intelligibility was it pulled me back into the concrete action always. That it wasn't so much the context as the action, which was really important and significant in understanding the object, the artifact. When I say object, I'm talking about everyday objects, things you can touch. Well, thanks, Valerie. What came in the other groups? Bueller, anyone?
Yeah, I'm sort of hesitant about speaking on behalf of the group because I was the least sort of prepared for it. But it was, to me, very interesting that, as I did in an earlier group, this group focused upon community and what a website can do, especially in the coming days of post-COVID, in terms of strengthening community amongst people who are in desperate need of support.
And it was, I mean, it was interesting to look at this is the same group, and I'll get Melissa to jump in. The kind of way that they started with a picture of typical families to establish a connection. It was kind of getting connected, becoming community, becoming part of this. This is you, that kind of way, and then moving on. The other thing was interesting was the future orientation, the way that you then went on to, don't panic, become informed. I'm obviously trans, and sort of that kind of future orientation of a kind of mixture of the kind of practical emotional management, but also practical physical management, and that kind of really nice intimate mix between those two. They're not separate, and that's what they enabled to do very well. Melissa?
Yeah, I mean, you two have said most of the things. I just think also when we were talking about community, we were talking about the power of community to help people to become active, and to people drawing on that community to develop their own agency, for example, to be honest with, or to say, I have an instinct about this, and to tell their medical team that this is what they want to do, or, so just drawing on that collaborative power, really.
I think that, go on, John.
I was just going to say that actually the interesting thing with the group actually was the discussion then moved on to compare and contrast, saying other groups, both Melissa has experienced, but also then comparing it back to this group, starting to see these analogies to the way community is formed and sustained.
It was certainly, there was a kind of, well, firstly, the future orientation piece is really important, and it came up a little bit in a group I was in earlier, that what we heard a number of times was that imagining the future, particularly in the early days of caring for a child who tube feeds, is seen by many parents as a luxury. It's not something they do. It's not something they feel that they emotionally able to do. You have this idea that you'll go into hospital if it's a newborn. You'll go into hospital and you'll come home. And a lot of people know this "Welcome to Holland" poem that's given to many people whose children have Down syndrome, and it's kind of like you thought you were going on holiday to Italy, and you end up in Holland. And they think they're coming home, and instead of what they thought, they've got this child and a tube which the child can pull out, and every time it goes back in, they have to go back to hospital or put it back in themselves. A whole load of stuff going on. The idea of the future is not something that's available to them at that time, as they've related it to us. It's so in the moment at first. And then when it starts to get less that, the idea of the future is very difficult because it's uncertain. It feels like, why would you latch onto something you don't even know may happen? And that hesitance and that difficulty is fueled by the medical occupation with weight gain. And we've been working with some people in Queensland, and we've now got not a protocol yet, but a thing that's now being used in clinics, which says on the day of tube initiation, i.e. the first day the tube gets in, you have to mention tube weaning. if it's going to, unless it's known to be lifelong. That the day you put it in, you have to also talk about the day it might go out. Even if you can't say when that will be, you have to actually make it talkable about. You have to say, we expect that we will be tube weaning. It might be months, it might be years. These will be the conditions that will happen. These will be the services that will help you do that. Parents don't get that. They don't get that.
That immediately establishes a future orientation. The question is how best to do that with parents, because in the website, it's done by little things, just taking these steps, whereas that's a kind of big one where you really look to the end. So there's kind of a difference between that.
It is. And what I'd love to have a discussion with Anna Stetsenko on is, because I know ontologically she's saying every act is always committed and works towards a future. And I completely buy into her idea that, kind of transformative agency comes from us taking a committed stance in the world and acting to make the futures that ought to be happen. What I'd love to ask her is, how do you, in her framework, account for these situations where that future isn't so available? It's just too scary, too difficult, too uncertain, ambiguous. And she's not talking about naive utopias. Her version of that says we can be concrete in what we want without being closed, right? You can be work in a committed stance towards something that's precise but open, definitely. But certainly, if you talk to a parent of a child who tube feeds in the first 3 to 6 weeks, perhaps even months, future is not a thing. Like, it's just, if you're feeding a child every 20 minutes, 24 hours a day, there's not a lot of space left to think about what 2 years down the track might be. The other thing around community was so interesting. I was really surprised by this, that we thought at first what parents would really want was a tube feeding community. And a lot of them do, but actually, that's not true. What they said they wanted was to be able to talk to somebody else who'd been through it. I don't think that's the same as community. What they wanted was somebody who knew what it was like and could give them advice and understand it. When it came to community, what they really wanted was not to be excluded from wider community. And when they're talking about the images, and John, you mentioned this, as we started to think about developing new resources, and I'll show you one in a second, we co-designed with them, and they said one of the principles is every child in it has to be represented as happy and playful and healthy. The second one is that people who don't tube feed or have never seen a tube-fed child have to see themselves in the imagery that we produce. We don't want to be seen as another community. We want to be seen as part of the main community. And so it wasn't for the parents about wanting to establish a tube feeding community. It was about that not being a thing. In fact, it was about tube feeding not being a community. It was about being part of the main one. Of course, connection with the parents of tube feed was important. But in fact, it was saying the more we kind of other ourselves, the bigger the barriers are. They didn't want that. So what they want, one of the parents said, and we started using it, is we want tube feeding to be everybody's business. Right? Like kind of everybody's business. And so particularly because imagery around tube feeding has long been taken over by childhood cancer campaigns. You've got the grey, black and white image of the baby on their side in a hospital bed with the tube here. Probably, nasty hospital bed with rails and things like that. Like if you want to make a child look sick, shove a tube up your nose and you're pretty much done. Right? That's kind of how it's been used. And they were like, no. We want images that include children who tube feed alongside other children. Like it was all about not putting a boundary around kind of tube feeding. So it's really interesting. And we were quite surprised by that because we thought what they'd be wanting us to do would be to create more tube feeding groups and stuff. And we said, we'll have a tube feeding picnic. And they were like, yes, but only if everybody else is invited. Right? So it was kind of...
Nick, in terms of using chat, I think what you've just spoken about is the bottom of the triangle, which I regard as describing the environment. And it's what I use to generate conversation. And you, in what you've just been speaking about, you have mentioned rules, community, and division of labor. And so in setting up a website using chat as your guide, I think you've just wrapped up the importance of rules, community, division of labor, and their interaction. Thank you.
I think there is, a lot about, and I think Jill, you actually mentioned kind of unsettling the division of labour as well earlier. Judy, you mentioned there about kind of Vadabonka. Do you expand on that perhaps for us?
Yesterday morning, we had heard Jennifer's talk about her very recent paper, it's in press, about moral imagining, and it was around children, young people in alternative schools, and that looking at what we are as a group, a relationship, and then what is possible. That's not exactly what she said, but that's part of it. And she talked about the moral part of it is what ought to be, what we ought to do. And I feel there's a connection with what you're doing. It's the parents in the ought, and even trying to normalize and to bring it as part of regular life and regular community, I think fits with that too. Anyway, that's...
Nick, can I throw something else in here on the question of deafness? During the couple of decades after the Second World War, the fad among deaf educators was lip reading. And it was believed that in order to integrate deaf people into the wider community, they should definitely not use sign language, because this would mean hearing people couldn't understand what they were saying and vice versa. Now, thanks to the social movements in the 60s, mainly, I think, this was transformed by deaf people themselves, who rebelled and stormed, Houses of Parliament and everything, to ensure that deaf people would learn sign language so that they could organise and speak to each other. Having spoken to each other and formed themselves into pressure groups, self-help groups, or whatever you want to call it, they could then, in fact, find their place in the wider community as equals. But the attempt to go straight to integration, which then disempowered them, was the issue. So it's just a variation on what you're saying.
In fact, Andy, I experienced an interesting example of that. So I'm really into roller coasters, as you can see. I was at Luna Park 2 weeks ago with a friend of mine who I'd met through a Facebook affinity group, who is profoundly deaf and normally lip reads. But fun fairs and amusement parks are noisy places. And when you're in a group of three, you can't always look at the person. And it so happens that British Sign Language and Auslan are very, very similar, 90% the same, which I was really surprised at. And I know British Sign Language. And so we were able to communicate quite a lot. And what we decided to do is there aren't established terms. So he's got the Facebook group of us now. We're developing our own set of signs. Physical signs, so like an inverted roller coaster would be like that, so that people whose legs are hanging down under the track. And in fact, it's what you mentioned, Andy, is like, well, it should be on him to lip read. It doesn't work in those environments, and so he's enrolled us all into developing a kind of a shared sign language for it. Just anyway, nice connection. What I would like to do now is show you one thing that is an outcome of some of the work we did with parents, and that is, hopefully you'll be able to hear it. It's this very short, really, really short video. Are you now seeing a fairly blank screen? Yeah, thanks, John. Okay, here we go. 40 seconds.
Children who are tube-fed connect with others over a meal just like you. Whether eating with a feeding tube, hands, or knife and fork, it's not just about the food. It's about the people you share it with. Parents, siblings, relatives, friends. The tube fills stomachs, but sharing a meal fills hearts. My tube, my family.
So we have made putting it next tube feeding everybody's business. And so helped by many, many people, we now have a little library of videos like this, 30 seconds long, all with that kind of same look. And all of them are My Tube, My Life, but there's My Tube, My Play, My Tube, My Freedom. What's another one? Let's have a look. And My Tube, My Family. Yeah. So that's kind of where I just wanted to kind of land with this was, I know we haven't been very heavy on the theory because I know you've done that a lot this week. So I thought it would be a little bit more kind of in the concrete, but I would put my hand on my heart and say we would have not have done this without chat. Like, although, you know, without a lot of things, but to me, it was kind of the way of noticing things in the data, in what parents were telling us. Like, chat was there all the way, and imagining why something like this video I think might be quite powerful, why something like the childfeeding.org was important, why we needed to have an artist on our team, all those things. Like, it's chat that's been a huge part of bringing us there. And particularly over the year, reading Annalisa Sanino, I've known and worked with for a long time, but Anna Stetsenko has been hugely formative for me for this year. Kind of this idea of a committed, you know, kind of research. And it freaked out the pediatrician at first, because what he wanted to do was a randomized control trial, which we may still end up doing. But he's now out there going to medical conferences saying, as medics, we have to stand up and say, well, you know, what do we stand for? Are we here to make sure children gain weight, or are we here to work with families to make sure that their children feel loved? Because that's what matters to families. And so that's kind of where we've gone. That was the landing point I wanted to get to. There's 10 minutes left. If you have questions, comments, I have nothing more to kind of throw at you. You might be extremely hungry and just want to finish now. I would not be judgmental if you were. But yeah, that's kind of what I had from me. So the floor is yours now.
Nick, I just want to say that sometimes I felt research is just research, but from this research project, I felt that you are transforming or actually influencing people's life. And especially when you were sharing the story about the child who says, the favorite part of the house is the kitchen. I could see how you have transformed another person's life. And I found it's so meaningful. The academic research can be more than theory. It can be so powerful to transform lives. And I just feel like it's so meaningful, and thank you. And it has been a wonderful session. I really enjoyed it.
And you know, that's not thank you. I'm glad you recognize that's what we're going for and, you know, struggling with. And that's the reason why I go to chat. You know, Vygotsky was not interested in freezing the world and looking at how it was yesterday. He was interested always in a world in motion, a world coming to be, and was really clearly, and his colleagues, and you know, much getting their hands dirty and joining in many ways. I'm really interested methodologically to start taking further the idea of reclaiming the experiment as a way for an exercise in scientific control, as to one of losing control, but actually being messy with the world. I think, you know, I'd really love to start doing that. I think that's probably, if I got some money for research, I'd probably want to do something like that. But yeah, I feel very affirmed by this through, particularly reading more around Stetsenko's work, as she talks about kind of how committed, you know, kind of the researchers and the origins of chat work to this kind of thing. But thanks, I'm really pleased that you took that current from it. So yeah, that's made my day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nick, have you come across instances where cultural differences, ethnicity has been an issue? And if so, how have you handled this?
Yeah, so if you notice on the childfeeding.org, there's a tab at the top that says Kuzi Meals.
Yeah.
Kuzi is Nepali for joy, happiness, and meals is an English word, obviously. And we got a grant from Southeast Sydney Local Health District to work with the Nepalese community there. And it came up in one of the subgroups that there are particular things. It's a fast-growing population in Australia, or was until the borders shut. There are particular things around parental shift work, around grandparents or in-laws involvement in being often the primary carers for children, a cultural passage called Pasni, which typically happens at 6 months for boys in Nepal, around the first time you'd consume rice. And so we work with a lot of Nepalese families who have children who have feeding difficulties, not all tube fed, but some kind of, still kind of with some feeding difficulties, like diagnosed ones. And yeah, there were very different things coming up there, very different sets of concerns. Ultimately, what mattered was very similar. What mattered to the parents was really similar. It was around wanting their child to feel loved, wanting their child to be involved in all the things that are developmentally good for them, wanting to be free of family conflict, wanting to have the family involved, not freaked out or turn away. So yeah, and that's why there's a whole part of the website which is in dual language, both in Nepali and in English, because it addresses some particular things there. But it was interesting that, like, yeah, what matters has its nuanced reflections, and the kind of the concrete manifestations of difficulties were sometimes quite specific to that community and sometimes not. But deep down, what matters is, you know, kind of, I think most parents, I might even say every parent, just wants their child to feel loved, right? And yeah.
Very nice.
What other questions or comments do you have?
Can I go, John?
Yeah, great, go away.
Nick, you're very familiar with chat, and you've worked a lot with Anne Edwards and using different concepts. And I know you asked us to familiarize ourselves with the transcript, but I think it takes, having done research myself, classroom research, and then had transcripts and been going through the data, looking for the concepts. After a while, they become evident. But I think for new researchers, I think this is a really big task, and how to take the transcript and actually know the concepts that you think are going to work to help you interpret and make meaning and to actually transform, but what's, you know, make changes, you know, as the end result. You know, it takes quite a bit of time, I think, to be able to recognize what the different concepts look like in data.
I think,
comment on that?
Absolutely. I think that's a really helpful comment. And I put in the chat a paper which I frequently refer others to and reread myself, because I think it's a really beautiful laying out of how you can put theory to work generally, and particularly in this case, the Vygotsky theory. I think an important step, although I don't think it's necessarily sort of, well, again, we reject a lot of papers that just go this far, is, like you say, you have to kind of find a connection between the manifestation in the data and the concept as you're understanding it, as it's been produced by somebody else in a text. And that hunt is a really formative thing. You know, some people criticize it as kind of painting by numbers, you know, like, oh, there's common knowledge, there's relational expertise, there's, you know, kind of relational agency, and you get your coding software, and there you go. I don't think that's a mundane thing to do. I think that's a really important thing to do, because doing that works back on you, right? There's that reverse action. What the concepts mean starts to change as you start to think, well, hang on, is that or is that that? Is that a conflict of motives? Really? Is that, you know, kind of whatever it might be. That hunting and kind of matching, if you like, between the data and the concept, where both of them kind of are in kind of the meaning of the data and the meaning of the concept, neither are fixed, right? That's really interesting. Then I think what comes next is the real trick, and this is what the kind of the turning the handle papers that we reject from studies in continuing education fail to do, is, and now what? And that's what that Brostrom paper does really well. David mentioned the metaphor of theory as a musical instrument. No, you've got to play it. You don't just find it in the data, you've got to do something with it. And I love the idea of, you know, okay, I've got my chat, and, you know, I'm a viola player, so, like, you know, I've got to put the bow on the string and make some notes and make a melody or whatever it is. And Brostrom do this really, really well, but they look in some data of children's play and they say, here's what scaffolding looks like. Here's scaffolding in in the data. Here's a zone of proximal development. And then they take it forward and they say, that's interesting, because when you see play like that, we can make a real distinction between that episode of play there and this one here. And because of our theory, that difference is not a small thing, it's a huge thing for child development. So two things that would have looked the same to the everyday eye, all of a sudden, when you look at it using chat, you can see a difference that wouldn't have otherwise been apparent. That difference is made significant through chat in their paper. And then they take it even further and say, and using chat again, we can tell you how to make that more developmentally significant kind of play happen. Boom! That's singing, that's playing a musical instrument with theory, right? But to start off with, they had to do what you described, Judy, which was find scaffolding in the data. And that's a really important process. I don't dismiss it at all. You know, kind of, I don't think it's painting by numbers. It's actually a really formative thing, and done well, you get that kind of wonderful reverse action happen, that your understanding of whatever concept it be might change. Not only your understanding of the data, but your understanding of the concept. And yeah, that's, I'm a really lazy academic. I claim to have found most of the shortcuts that exist. One in the use of theory and analysis yet eludes me. I've failed to find that. It's always slow, but I love marinating in data, particularly when you have chat with you at your side. It's just the best part of my job. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on that? So yesterday with Joss Nuttall, she was talking about you'd often start with your chat concepts that you're looking for in your data, and you'd also do some inductive analysis. Do you do that as well? And if so, what method do you use?
Yes. Hang on one second. I can. So back in 2009, I wrote a paper. Unfortunately, it's an open access one, so you can go straight there. And this comes back to, although in that paper I don't talk about chat or anything like that, it's kind of quite generic. The one thing about going looking for theoretical concepts in the data is great, but there's a risk that you miss what matters to the people who helps you get the data in the first place. And you know, that's what Dan Edwards' voice in my head is saying, but what matters to them? And so I always think of analysis as three questions. What are the data telling me? And I mean me or us. Like, they don't just speak, they speak to me. I read it with my eyes, my body, my male, white privilege, all those things, right? They speak to me. What do I want to know? Okay, that's my theoretical kind of, I just managed to not finish the word lens there, David. My theoretical, you know, kind of interest, values, predilections, affinities, and what's the changing relationship between those? So how is what the data are telling me shifting what it is that I want to know? How is what I want to know drawing attention, like kind of making me hear things in the data in particular ways? And so yes, it's always for me a question of both, a kind of both sides of that. And really the engine of the analysis is making sure the relationship between those two things change. Yeah. We're at 12:31. I will always be the last one to leave in these places. So if people, you know, kind of, if we were in a physical room, I wouldn't be running out the door. I'd be hanging around as people chat. So John, I don't know if you want to call us close, but if people have things they want to follow up privately, then I'm not going to run away straight.
Well, people will need a bit of grab because we've got the consultations coming up in half an hour's time, and I've got to set up the breakout rooms. Now, remember, what will happen here is you'll come back, or preferably stay in this space, and just go to the breakout rooms. It's voluntary, of the people that you're talking to. I really think methinks the researcher doth protest too much. I can't even imagine Nick as a lazy academic, but in fact, Sharon Hongzi and Jill will get a chance to pick up on those tips that he has, and the rest of you obviously know where you've selected that. So it's just a matter of coming back, going into the room at the appropriate time, and having that chat. At 3:30, we'll all be back here together, and again, we'll be breaking off into reformatted breakout rooms for the forum groups that we had at the beginning, and we'll be reassembling for that. And then coming back briefly, we'll come back to have Andy tell us about agency, there is his paper is up in his space, so do be aware that more is going into that resource folder, and so Nick, you can get into that and see Jennifer's latest paper because it's there. So be aware of that, and anything else that comes in will go in as I get hold of that, and then we'll finish up with our final ceremony, which I have no idea what we're going to do, but we'll make it up at the time in collective agency. Any questions, comments? Okay, I'll leave everything open. Everybody's still here, and yes, let's put our hands together and thank Nick for, as usual, a really absolutely inspiring, and yeah, as the final major presentation, it really does sum up everything we've been doing here. So I'm just so happy that we had that. So it's just wonderful. So I can actually do it with real sounds at my microphone.